morning and welcome to you all. This morning for the first keynote address of the DARE Global Forum 2025, we have the privilege of hearing from Professor Jung from Sao Paulo, Brazil. Professor Sung is one of the most well-known contemporary liberation theology professors. He has published over 24 articles and delivered many lectures, teaching, inspiring, and raising awareness about the relationship between theology and the economy, as well as education theory that is informed by solidarity. Several of his publications have been translated from Portuguese into Korean, Italian, Spanish, English, and German. Today, Professor Sung will deliver a keynote address on the topic, the Neoliberal Theology of Original Sin and the Original Sin of Capitalism. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Jung.
Thank you. First, I want to apologize for my English. I need some days to my brain working in English, but it's the first presentation, so I'm sorry. So I hope you can understand me. My presentation will be shared, the full text through internet. Okay, so if you don't understand, you can read later. So I should like to begin by thanking the organizer. Well, I have the problem of the line. Yeah, you need line, né? Yeah, but so I cannot see. Okay, I want to thank you for organizer of the forum for their invitation to me present some theological reflection on two of the main challenges of our time: serious social inequality and environmental crisis. My reflection will not be focused on socio-economic and analysis of these problems, but on the theological and mythical premises of neoliberal capitalism that reject, impede, or complicate collective struggle to overcome this crisis. No, I have a problem too. In the tradition of liberation theology, in its various strands, it's taken for granted that it's impossible to produce a theology committed to the problems of society without dialoguing with and using contribution from the broadest range of social and human science. Nevertheless, we cannot forget that modern science have as their object of study categories such as poverty or gender relationship, while liberation theology has its fundamental question, the struggle for the life or death of the people. The fundamental question is not social inequality as such, but it is the possibility or not for human beings to fulfill desire and right to live with dignity. The very discussion which is important about question of identity, race, gender, sexuality, etc., presupposes that these human beings are alive. And in the capitalist system, the condition and requirement for being alive come down to having access to the market, that is, being a consumer. And what makes it impossible for a significant part of the world population to live with dignity, dignity is primarily the process of exclusion from the market system. The capitalist free market system does not kill directly, but indirectly, by not allowing people to live. As Pope Francis says, this economy kills. In this sense, the problem of the environmental crisis has also to be analyzed in terms of the dichotomy of life or death. But we have to remember that life as such does not exist, or must not be understood as a substance that exists in itself and independently of the lives of other living creatures and other non-living elements that exist in the world. When you talk about life, you have to ask, whose life? Oh, sorry, I forgot to do that. Yeah. And we live in a time in which we have no social consensus about these fundamental human principles. A significant part of the world's population thinks that all people have the right to live with dignity and therefore organize a society, and or the state has the duty to defend the fundamental right of vulnerable people. On the other hand, neoliberalism and its allies insist that this desire of the first group to implement a project of social justice is the source of the evil inherent in all social and economic problems. In other words, it is the original sin of economic and social crisis. To understand better this idea of original sin in the economy, it's useful to go back to the idea of endogenous theology proposed by Hugo Assmann, one of the main Latin American liberation theologians. In his book, The Idolatry of Market, which he wrote with Francine Kilmer, he says that the main theological authority that shapes our time is one that comes from the economy, what could be called the endogenous theology of economic ideas. This theology has infiltrated everyday language about economic issues and goes on to form part of the mythical universe of ordinary people common sense idea and the way people are led to think about the most ordinary industrial economic issues. In other words, the theology of neoliberalism has as one of its fundamental concepts is its notion of original sin, that is, the pretense to knowledge. For neoliberals, the origin of all economic and social problems in the modern world is the claim to act consciously and intentionally to solve social problems such as poverty, unemployment, or environmental crisis. And these claims rests on prior claim to know how the modern market works. These theological premises help us to understand why Pope Francis is accused by Christians and non-Christians of being heretic and communist, an instrument of the devil. With regard to this, the aim of this talk is 1. Dispose and critique the neoliberal theology that turns upside down the interpretation of organized struggle for the right of the poor to live and to solve the environmental crisis. B. To offer a liberating interpretation of the myth of Adam and Eve. And 3. Critique theologically capitalism's original sin. First, 1. Neoliberal theology and original sin. The myth of the development, the myth that shaped the economic and social discussion of the 20th century before the victory of neoliberalism in 1980s, is an example of the direct role of the myth in the social sciences. In the words of Celso Furtado, one of the leading Latin American economists of the 20th century, at least 90% of the writing on economic development between 1944 and 1970 is founded on the idea, taken as a given, that economic development as it has been practiced by countries that led industrial revolution can be universalized, unquote. In other words, there was a presupposition shared by the various strands of analysis and the proposals in political economy. The concept of universal here implied the idea that all people in the world have the right to receive, at least in part, the benefits of this development. It is this overall common objective that made it possible for groups with conflicting proposals to dialogue. In the face of the current crisis, we have to recognize a fundamental problem. Today, we do not have a myth shared by the main actors in this debate that allows for a fruitful dialogue. Take, for example, the Balfour's assertion, quote, "The mere fact that 1% possess as much wealth as more than half of humanity shows how perverse, profound, unequal the world's social situation is." On the other hand, the neoliberals and their allies argue that this concentration of wealth is helpful and is the just result of the merits of the economic actors that were efficient in the market, and that what is called social justice does not exist. So we have at least two paradigms for the analysis of social reality. For neoliberals, human rights, especially social rights, do not exist. As Ludwig von Mises, Hayek's mentor, puts it, quote, "The worst of all this delusion is the idea that nature has bestowed upon every man certain rights. According to this doctrine, nature is open-handed toward every child born. Every word of this doctrine is false." Unquote. On this view, social justice does not exist. There is only the justice of the free market. Consequently, it's necessary to avoid economic, social, and environmental actions and policies that seek to control and or intervene in the spontaneous order, the market. When he was awarded the Nobel Prize of Economics in 1974, Hayek gave a lecture under the title "The Pretense of Knowledge," in which he asserted the position that economic crisis, inflation, and unemployment that had broken out at the beginning of 1970 was the result of the mistake of Keynesian and socialist economists who had claimed to understand the functioning of a spontaneous system, the market, and interfered with it to solve the economic and social problem. In other words, that good intention of deliberately doing a social good presupposes the claim to know the unknowable, and that is the original mistake of economics and social problems. In religious or mythical language, it is Adam and Eve's original sin. At the end of the lecture, Hayek said, "In the social field, the erroneous belief that exercise of some power would have beneficial consequences, it's likely to lead to a new power to coerce other men being conferred on some authority. Even if such power is not in itself bad, its exercise is likely to impede the functioning of these spontaneous ordering forces by which, without understanding them, man in fact so largely assisted in the pursuit of his aims. The recognition of insuperable limits of his knowledge ought indeed to teach the student of society a lesson in humility, which should guard him against becoming an accomplice in man's fatal striving to control society, a striving which makes him not only a tyrant over his fellows, but which may well make him the destroyer of a civilization which no brain has designed, but which has grown from the free efforts of millions of individuals." Unquote. Hayek associates the idea of original sin with that of eschatology, the end of humanity, even though he does not explicitly use this concept. This association of original sin and eschatology makes sense since that the catastrophe end of humanity, on this view, is the result of falling into the temptation of original sin, whereas the virtue of humility in the face of a spontaneous system would lead humanity to the fulfillment of all its desires. And it's, as he said in famous 1944 book, The Road of Serfdom, wherever the barriers to the free exercise of the human ingenuity were removed, men became rapidly able to satisfy every widening range of desire. Unquote. In his last book, The Fruits Concept, The Fatal Concept, The Errors of Socialism, he says, quote, our civilization depends not only for the origin, but also for the preservation on what can be precisely described only as the extended order of human cooperation, and an order more commonly, if somewhat misleading, known as capitalism. Unquote. What is at stake here is much more than question of instrumental or scientific reason. It is the utopian myth of liberalism. This is fundamental myth that gives meaning to our attempts at progress, the limits of meanings and ethical values. What we are dealing with here is not neoliberalism merely as an economic ideology or a new explanation of the world, but blueprint for a civilization, including its spirituality. In discussing the concept of original sin in Hayek thought here, we are obviously not using the concept in the sense it has traditionally had in Western Christianity. That is, the chronological sense that Adam and Eve sinned changed the ontological condition of subsequent human beings. Still less are we using it to imply that after Adam and Eve sinned, all human beings were marked by this sin. In order to attain eternal salvation, had to be baptized and freed from the penalties of this sin. In Hayek's lecture, it's clear that without explicitly using the expression, he is referring to the idea of sin that is the root of all the social and the personal sins within a specific system. In this sense, the original sin in the neoliberal capitalism perspective is the claim to knowledge applied in the social sphere. In contrast, in the Marxist perspective, primitive accumulation could be considered that original sin, while in Pauline thought, quote, the love of money is the root of all evils, unquote. And it's also clear that in his lecture, Hayek is not using the concept of mistake in the sense of mistake resulting from ignorance or a logical or methodological error, which would be a merely epistemological problem, but within the idea of evil in a moral sense, as when he talks about pretense or conceit, the term used in the title of this book, The Fatal Concept, which is associated with the idea of original sin. In short, Hayek argues this arrogant claims to know the right direction society should take can lead, the right direction society should take can lead a proud person to become not just tyrant over their peers, but the destroyer of civilization, not created by any mind. If this premise is accepted, it imposes on believers in the free market the mission of fighting against the enemies of civilization, socialism and like. In this sense, the term free market means essentially a market free from intervention, from intervention or regulation by the state or society. In this way, it reduces reduces the concept of freedom, a central term for the modern society, modern world, and for Christianity as well, to the idea of being free from external pressures, especially from interventions by a socialist or welfare state. In this perspective, original sin would have at least two components: the arrogant claim to knowledge and the hubris of consciously and deliberately doing social good. But before going into the issue of consciously and deliberately doing good, we need to explore a little more the idea of spontaneous system, a fundamental idea for Hayek. In the world of Latin American liberation theology, it's common to associate the mechanical Cartesian view of the world with capitalism. Fridtjof Capra, an author much used by Leonardo Boff in his eco-theological reflections, says that the systemic approach that underlines the ecological science works with the notion of approximate knowledge, in contrast to the old scientific paradigm based on the Cartesian belief in the certainty of scientific knowledge. Science can never provide any complete and definitive understanding, unquote. One anthropological conclusion of this critique of the modern Cartesian paradigm would be the one Leonardo Boff sets out in his famous book, Cry of the Earth, Cry of the Poor. Quote, anthropocentrism derives from this arrogant interpretation of the human beings, unquote. Curiously, we have the same critique of Boff and Hayek. This scientific paradigm of principle of the neoliberalism or Hayek already embodies a critique of the modern Cartesian scientific paradigm or modern scientific rationality. Furthermore, Hayek's critique of socialism and welfare state is based on the critique of modern rationality. In case the use of the idea of original sin in economic debate makes it difficult to follow the argument, I think it would be useful to say some word on the metaphor of original sin. The use of the term metaphor here does not mean diminishing the scientific or theoretical nature of an argument. What I should be, where is the note? I think I'm lost. Yeah, yeah. As the evolutionary biologist Richard Leontin put it, quote, it's not possible to do work of science without using a language that is filled with metaphor, unquote. In the very same sense, George Lakoff and Mark Johnson, two of the leading theoreticians in the area of linguistics, have said, quote, we use ontological metaphors to comprehend events, actions, activities, and states. Events and actions are conceptualized metaphorically as object, activity as substance, state as a container. For Hayek, the problem of declaiming the knowledge becomes crucial in as much as there is a deliberate attempt to establish the common good or what's called social justice. His conclusion that this attempt to create collective good leads to the destruction of civilization is not merely on the idea that the claim to knowledge is mistake. No, the base of such a destructive conclusion that even justified support for bloody dictatorship like Pinochet in Chile cannot merely an epistemological principle. In fact, it also depends on the ethical and anthropological vision. In his chapter on social justice, in his book, Law, Legislation, and Liberty, Hayek says, The gospel of social justice aims at much more sordid sentiment, the dislike of people who are better off than oneself, or simply envy, that most anti-social and evil of all passions. As John Stuart Mill called it, that animosity to great wealth, which represented as a scandal that some should enjoy riches while others have basic needs unsatisfied, and camouflage under the name of justice what has nothing to do with justice, unquote. All the Christian arguments and all the social struggle carried out by different groups in society are justified in the name of social justice, in the name of the satisfaction of basic needs that enable the poor to stay alive with minimum dignity. The reason is that all human beings, independently of their economic or social situation, are beings with human dignity and so have human rights. However, this assertion of Hayek's radically suspends the idea of justice. For the neoliberals, there is no such thing as the idea of social justice, but only the justice established in market contracts. In this upside-down world, it is the rich who deserve to be defended against the animosity and envy of the poor and their allies. Without exposing the invention of the idea of justice and social ethics in our time, the ethical and theological argument of the Christian church and other groups and institutions that get lost in abstract rhetoric or worse, in religious justification of this lie. Unfortunately, the poor and the defenders of the poor rights to live are interpreted in neoliberal culture as envious, incompetent, who want to steal the wealth that the efficient deserve according to market justice. As Zygmunt Bauman says, quote, increasingly being poor is seen as crime, becoming poor as the product of criminal predisposition or intention, abuse of alcohol, gambling, drugs, truancy, and vagabondage. The poor, far from meriting care and assistance, deserve hate and condemnation as the very incarnation of sin, unquote. In the neoliberal culture, we have an anthropological view that is pessimist in terms of human ability to do good deliberately, and a vision of history marked by the idea of invisible hand of market and benevolent destiny. This is a modern view of history, since at its core is social development or evolution, which depends on its religious faith in the providential action of the invisible hand, the market. As Hugo Wasman says, this is a brutal relapse into a religion of destiny, in which human beings surrender to the whims of external forces that they do not control, except that this destiny, remote from human consciousness and will, is new regarded as scientific destiny, and moreover, providentially benevolent. The market mechanism acts as another name for the design of God, unquote. We humans do not naturally act in solidarity, but we are also not naturally perverse, and our knowledge is limited and imperfect. But this does not mean that we women cannot or should not interact with self-organizing system in the field of economy or ecology. As Paul Krugman, winner of the Nobel Prize of Economics in 2008, commented in discussing the economy as a self-organizing system, quote, self-organization is not necessarily or even presumptuously a good thing. Self-organization is something we observe and try to understand, not necessarily something we want, unquote. I have a problem with eyes. The neoliberal theology of original sin presupposes a faith in the free market with its utopia of a world in which the rich will fulfill all their desires while the poor will be excluded. And this idolatrous faith in the free market presupposes a theology of original sin that erects as its taboo our human desire to build a more just society. 2. A liberationist interpretation of the myths of Adam and Eve and capitalist original sin. After this criticism of neoliberal theology of original sin, someone might ask, is there still any point in discussing the idea of original sin? Wouldn't it be better to analyze the issue of evil in society without wasting time going back to the traditional ancient topic of original sin? Shouldn't we in fact learn the lesson of the Enlightenment and secularization that we should discuss social problems in terms of secular reasoning and not of theology or religion faith? I think that Enlightenment and modern reasoning are not enough to enable us to understand the fascination evil exerts on society and human beings, which is the other side of the discussion of original sin. As Matthew Carden says, quote, the Enlightenment aversion to original sin was consistent enough to bring rare consensus to such otherwise disparate thinkers as Voltaire and Rousseau, unquote. On the hand, quote, fading belief in original sin did not necessarily lead to an optimistic view of human nature, nor did it lead to any decline in the Atlantic slave trade, which did not peak until the final decades of the 18th century, unquote. As I said at the beginning of this talk, for liberation theology, the central issue is not the relationship between reason and religion or faith, but people's struggle between life and death, especially that of the poor and vulnerable. The importance or not of the theology of original sin has to do with the problem of the evil that creates human suffering. We do have to face the issue of original sin, image of God, and the dialectic between freedom and faith in our time, one that is marked by neoliberal domination and growing power of authoritarian regimes. In these debates, we need to recognize that human beings do not naturally show solidarity to the extent that our dreams of a just society might suppose, without conflict of interest. That is why, as Assmann says, I quote, it's wrong to relegate to a secondary position or the list of tacit presuppositions the complicated problem of individual and collective education, or more correctly, conversion, which is essential if there are to be predisposition for effective solidarity. Unquote. To achieve this, he says, we need, quote, to recover the wise and realistic side of the myth about the fall or corruption, unquote. The question of original sin, a sort of an interpretative key to what can be expected of human beings in society. For all these reasons, we say with Assmann, quote, the idea of original sin is hugely relevant, unquote. To recover the wise side of the myth of the fall, in particular the myth of we find in the Bible, we need to be clear, first of all, that the term original sin, which is not in the Bible, belongs to the Western Christian tradition, whereas in the Eastern Orthodox tradition used the term ancestral sin. Moreover, in the Eastern tradition, ancestral sin does not impute their sin and guilty to all humanity. Ancestral sin is not a matter of biological transmission. In contrast, the idea of original or ancestral sin does not exist in Jewish tradition, though it recognizes that there was an effect following the sin of Adam and Eve. Secondly, we need to be clear that the word sin does not appear in chapter 2 and 3 of Genesis, the story of Adam and Eve, but only in the chapter 4, where we have the story of the murder of Adam and Cain. Abel and Cain. And there is not reference to law or the breaking of any law. Nonetheless, the whole Western tradition is marked by this question of Adam and Eve's original sin, the eating of the fruit that gave knowledge of good and evil, and by Augustine, Adam's choice fundamentally changed, and by Augustine's thesis that Adam's choice fundamentally changed human nature and condemned universal humanity because of Adam's sin passed through all men. If you to face down neoliberal theology, as Juan Luis II has said, we need to free ourselves from idolatrous imperial theologies, starting with Augustine's interpretation of original sin. In other words, in order that liberation theology can continue to be liberating in the face of new questions and new historical challenges, we need to take up the constant task of liberating our theology. To do this, we need to be suspicious of our interpretation of social reality and also of our theological reflections. Therefore, we need to discover, if only briefly, the structure of the argument in favor of original sin in the Western Christian tradition. For most students of the question, Augustine is the real creator of the dogma of original sin. Augustine, accepting the thesis that the church teaches and requires that the children should be baptized for forgiveness of sin, accept that these children have within them a sin that needed to be forgiven or redeemed, even if that have not reached the age at which they can sin. With this reasoning, Augustine reaches a theological conclusion, quote, "Inasmuch as they do not commit any sin in the tender age of infancy, by their actual transgression, original sin only is left." Unquote. The theology of original sin, which became a dogma, is the result of a logical necessity to justify the unquestionable validity of Christian practice. There is a similarity between Hayek's theology of original sin and Augustine's. The justification depends on the sacredness of an institution. In Hayek's cases, is the sacredness of the free market. In Augustine, the sacredness of the Christian church. If we deny the sacredness of the free market and the church, the sacredness of the idea of original sin, in other words, something unquestionable that turns human ethical values upside down, disappears. And once the sacred character of the myth of the original origins of evil disappears, we can learn from the ancient wisdom that is embodied in this myth. The critique of the sacralization of the market and the church does not mean that we have to fight the market or church since that market and the church are institutions necessary for the functioning of economic and religious relationship. What we should criticize is the sacralization that makes them unquestionable, sacred. This discussion takes us to the fundamental question about original sin in and of capitalism. How does society determine what is more important? The life of people who are less efficient economically, or the criterion of economic efficiency in the search of the maximization of wealth? Max Horkheimer, following Schopenhauer thinking, quote, "The most important doctrine in both religions, Judaism and Christianity, is the doctrine of original sin. It has determined history down to the present and determines the world for thinkers today. This is only possible on the assumption that God creates human being with free will," unquote. This statement of Horkheimer presupposes an image of God that is the opposite of one in which history is moved by destiny or by evolution, in which human freedom does not have a significant role. As Severino Croato, a Brazilian Latin American biblist scholar, says, among the people that made up the atmosphere Israel breath, God arose out of chaos, and the world is born as hierophany, a manifestation of the divine. That is, the gods took the leading role and the human beings were in secondary position. In addition, in this myth, human beings were created to feed the gods, direct and maintain the sanctuaries of the gods, and this work was complemented by another directly related to the economic sphere. The destiny of human being was to work for the gods. In this worldview of religions of the ancient world, there is no room for the idea of freedom, still less the liberation of the serfs and slaves. This is what gives the idea of original sin highlighted by Schopenhauer and Horkheimer its importance. Since sin only exists when human beings can choose between two courses in life. That is, because God created human beings with free will. The idea of sin, which presupposes a first sin, is an affirmation of human freedom. While this interpretation of freedom and sin represents an advance, it's not enough to allow us to deal with the question raised by discussing of the original sin of Adam and the neoliberal capitalism. You have to face the challenge of rereading the biblical myth of Adam and Eve in a way that enables to find in it a wisdom that allows us to critique the neoliberal conception of original sin. To replace or reject the dogma of original sin, we need to be clear about the purpose of God's revelation in history. God does not reveal himself or God's self, to humanity so that we come to know something we couldn't know without his help. That means that revelation and dogma are not addition to scientific or theological discoveries about nature and humanity, or even the substance of God himself. God reveals God's self to us so that we human beings can become more human, ethically better, or in Christian language, so that we can become more holy in the way God is holy. That is, so that we can love as God loves. As Juan Luis II says, divine revelation is not deposit of correct information, but a real educational process. It's a process, a growth in humanity, unquote. The Javeh God who appears in the myth of Adam and Eve is the same God who revealed himself in Moses and said that he had seen the suffering and heard the cry of his people, the cry of slaves, and entered history to free them from slavery and gave them the promise of land where they could live in freedom and dignity. God's action in this Exodus shows us the intention of liberation. Consequently, the interpretation of the myth of Adam and Eve cannot be one that is subordinate the laws and dogmas of the church, including of the baptism of children. We saw earlier that the word of the idea of sin do not occur in chapter 2 and 3 of Genesis. Mark Smith, in his book, The Genesis of Good and Evil, the Fallout and Original Sin in the Bible, says, quote, several world-renowned biblical scholars have proposed that Genesis 2 and 3 represent an ascent to moral agency rather than a fall from grace. Unquote. This statement about the myth of Adam and Eve as an explanation of how human beings became human beings help us a lot to overcome a reading marked by religious vision in which the explanation of the fall justify oppression and injustice in society. But this is not enough for us to find in this Garden of Eden narrative the liberating character of God Yahweh. Francis Lambert, one of the leading proponents of liberal theology, he's an economist, suggests a very interesting approach to the interpretation of this text. After discussing the fact that the word sin only appears after the murder committed by Cain, he asked the following question. Does God have the right to issue whatever law he likes? If so, he would be a despotic and arbitrary God. From the point of view of human beings created by him, he would not have legitimacy. Thou shalt not kill. It's very different. It would be meaningful prohibition, one that could be freely accepted by human beings. But in paradise, the prohibition God issued is arbitrary. The only course open to a being with dignity is to breach it. Otherwise, human beings would lose their dignity with their freedom. Insofar as God's revelation on the biblical myth has the educational functioning of leading individuals and the community to see their place in the world and the correct way to live, Hinkelammer's interpretation makes sense. After all, what the myth teaches cannot be learned without taking account how the other side, the student, the pupil, interpret the teaching of commandment. The question is, does this prohibition of God make sense for human beings? If Adam and Eve accept this prohibition, even when they see it doesn't make sense, they are accepting the position assigned by myth of the other nations, namely that human beings are inferior beings to the gods and must simply obey the gods blindly. Most important of all, they must recognize that they are beings without dignity and without the ability to see the meanings of things for themselves. Adam and Eve will only succeed in learning or discovering that they are beings with dignity and freedom if they break this commandment. This arbitrary prohibition denies the human beings the freedom to satisfy their needs, whether for food or to know the meaning of things and history. And the process of discovering the meaning of life, history, and the difference between good and evil necessarily take place in dialogue with other people. It's impossible to become human beings subject outside a relationship with another person, human beings. Therefore, Hinkelammer says it In sharing the fruit with Adam, Eve confirms her freedom as a subject. Breaching the prohibition turns out to be requirement of freedom. Unquote. If it makes sense, it follows that, as Hinkelhammer says, the myth of paradise can be understood as the myth of legitimate rebellion, as Eric Fromm does as well. And it is rebellion that makes human beings free, and freedom makes them human. If human freedom is won through rebellion against unjust law and God, the end of the story of the Garden of Eden, when Adam and Eve leave paradise, cannot be interpreted as a punishment inflicted by God. We can see this in God's remarks in Genesis 3, chapter 3, 22. Quote, "See, the man has become like one of us," unquote. We criticize individuals who act irrationally or immorally because they seem to be coming close to the state of animals, who have no moral sense. In contrast, we admire people who do good to others freely and without thought of reward, and associate these attitudes with the holiness of divine spirit. So becoming like God cannot be proof that Adam and Eve did something very wrong. On the contrary, it is thanks to Eve's courage that the first human couple become like God. We could even imagine that God was pleased because his creation, the human beings, had found the way to become free. By acquiring knowledge of good and evil, human beings became free and also discovered the responsibility in history. History full as it is contradictions and challenges. Living presupposes producing food in natural settings that are not always favorable for this. Just as the joy of creating new life also means running the risk of death. In this sense, in the opinion of the scholars who have studied this story, the myth of Adam and Eve tells the story of the basis condition of human life and not of punishment of God or an original sin. 3. Capitalism's original sin, efficiency, and the lack of social inequality. Lack of social sensitivity. We can only have an awareness of right and wrong insofar as we challenge and breach arbitrary and unjust laws. If you do not challenge such laws, we only have a sentence of acceptance of the law, but not awareness of right and wrong. Therefore, what leads to an awareness of good and evil is a legitimate and even obligatory breach. These lines of argument clashes directly with Hayek's interpretation of original sin and the relationship between the awareness of good and evil and the laws of the market. In the capitalist world, to human beings with dignity and freedom, we need to rebel against the laws of the market that set economic efficiency as a means of the unlimited accumulation of capital as the ultimate criterion of social relationship above human life itself. This becomes clear, for example, in the creation of the modern slavery and the process of the abolition of the slavery. The need for workforce to increase economic production at the birth of capitalism create the system of modern slavery that took millions of people from Africa to America, and also create racist theologies and scientific theories to justify slavery. Later, because of theological advance and transformation in the world division of labor, the capitalist class justified the abolition of slavery in the name of economic efficiency. It's clear that there was also the fight of the enslaved people and the sectors of society that recognized their dignity. This battle is an example of legitimate rebellion against unjust law or an economic and legal system, a battle that enables us to have an ethical awareness of what is good and evil and what makes us fear. Without rejecting the absolute character of the law of value of the capitalist market system, we cannot fight efficiently for the right to live of the poor and those excluded from the market. Therefore, updating the myth of Adam and Eve, we can say that unless we challenge the god Mammon, the god money, and his sacred law of the accumulation of capital, we will not become free creatures endowed with dignity. On the hand, this relationship between On the other hand, this relationship between rebellion or breaching of the laws in freedom cannot be seen as something anarchic or abstract. If Eve's initial rebellion shows us the path to freedom, in the myth of Cain and Abel, we find a first illegitimate breaking of the moral law in Cain's murder of Abel. As Hitler says, quote, "This breaking of the law does not bring freedom and it's no way a legitimate rebellion against. Original sin, if you are logical, appears in the murder of a brother. Nevertheless, we cannot understand this original sin of murdering a brother as an isolated act. The story of evil in the myth of Cain and Abel is the beginning of the genealogy that ends in Lamech. And what the story shows us is the increase of violence to the point at which Lamech declares with pride, quote, "Hear my voice. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. If Cain is avenged sevenfold, truly Lamech 77-fold," unquote. And what underlines this evolutionary logic of evil is the technological progress associated with the desire for power and accumulation of wealth. Cain here is the symbol of the originator of civilization and the building of city, which in ancient time, when where the silent center of military and religious power, and the core of the exploitation of the world of rural people. The problem is not in technological evolution or progress as such, but in the separation of the economic and political interests of those who control this progress and the rest of the community or of society. The sin of murdering a brother or other members of the community is the expression of the conflict of economic, political, and social interests that is resolved by violence. A violence that is hidden by religious myth and unjust legal system. Francis Fukuyama, in his famous book, The End of History and the Last Man, says, technology makes possible the limitless accumulation of wealth, and thus the satisfaction of an ever-expanding set of human desires. This proclamation of the good news, summarized by Francis Fukuyama, is a modern liberal capitalist version, predating the neoliberal version. In Hayek's version, we find, in addition to the technology, the introduction of the free market as the agent for bringing about these desires. The articulation of the absolute criterion of economic efficiency and the free market requires a culture of social insensitivity. That is, the project of neoliberal capitalist civilization requires the destruction of a culture in which compassion for the poor and the inefficient is accepted as a moral values. In short, the liberating interpretation of the myth of the Garden of Eden that we have presented allow us to see what is original sin of capitalism, a sin that presents itself in a Trinitarian form. A. Economic efficiency to the ultimate criteria of life. B. Social insensitivity as a moral value. And C. The desire to accumulate unlimited wealth in attempt to be like the idol God. Final point. In order to critique the perverse neoliberal theology of original sin, we need a utopian perspective in which all human beings are treated and seen as creatures endowed with dignity and freedom. Start from this point, we need to develop a practical historical plan in which human beings, free from the main force that deprive them of freedom, such as poverty and tyranny, have the condition necessary to fight also against other forms of domination and oppression. The utopian horizon, which is a necessary condition for us to analyze the situation of human society, is not completely feasible historically. We desire this utopian horizon, but we are not able to create it within history. Accepting the limits and the possibilities of the historical context and the human future is also part of what we have to learn from the myth about original rebellion and original sin. Eve's rebellion in the myth of Adam and Eve is the first step in the discovery of human freedom. We can say that it's the original rebellion that creates the struggle for liberation, a liberation that does not occur after the final victory, but on the march or in the struggle itself. In this sense, human beings become free because they fight for liberation from injustice. Thank you.